What's up, guys? We're going to take a look at the Reconstruction. There are three phases to it, and I'm going to go ahead and cover phase one for you guys. It's a little complicated since why I'm making this video, so you can listen and just kind of follow along. I'll also share the PowerPoint as well too with you guys. But just to go over so you have a better understanding of Reconstruction and preparing you to go into American history too if you take it next year. Because if you don't have Reconstruction and don't understand what happened during Reconstruction, then you're going to have a hard time understanding why the nation was the way the nation was. Reconstruction is very, very influential in American history, almost as important as the Civil War itself. Reconstruction sets the table basically for the next 100 plus years. So from about 1870 all the way until the 1960s, Reconstruction and its failure and some of its successes, but primarily its failures, leads to the issues that the nation has during that time period of 1870 all the way up until the 1960s and the civil rights movement and legislation that was passed in Congress during that time period, the 1960s. So let's go ahead and let's jump into it. So, Reconstruction post Civil War. All right, the big question, what now? With war almost over, major questions started rising throughout the nation, such as after the South's destruction, how are we going to rebuild the South? William Tecumseh Sherman marched through Georgia, and in his own words, he was going to make Georgia howl. And he did. He left a trail of nothing but destruction as he went through Georgia. And that wasn't the only state that took a beating as well, too. All right, so how do we rebuild, all right, these southern states that have been utterly destroyed by war? All right, the states that left the Union, how will they come back into it? They're a bunch of traitors who committed treason. How are we going to bring them back into the Union? All right, what about the people who committed that treason? Are they going to be punished, such as Jeff Davis, Robert E. Lee, Alexander Stevens, these leaders of the Confederacy? Are they going to be punished and put in jail? Are they going to be sentenced to death for treason? What's going to happen with them? And then what about the 4 million African Americans that were just set free? What's going to happen to them? The 13th Amendment has passed, as you'll see here in a second. What's going to happen to them? How are they going to interact in society? And these are just some of the many questions that people had once the war was finished. Reconstruction is typically overlooked because of its complexity. To make it more simple, I will break it down into the three subsections. In this lesson here will be presidential Reconstruction and radical Reconstruction. So let's start with presidential Reconstruction. To understand how President Lincoln is going to handle Reconstruction, we have to take a look at this section of his second inaugural address when the war was almost over. And pardon this typo right there. I guess I did too quickly. But from his second inaugural address, he says this: with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So, with that being said, how is Lincoln going to go about Reconstruction? When you're watching this, you're going to have to answer that question. I just kind of want to see exactly what you're thinking. How is Lincoln going to go about Reconstruction? All right, reading that from his second inaugural address. All right, simply put, Lincoln had laid out a fairly simple plan for getting the states that removed themselves back into the Union. He called it a 10% plan. Basically, the 10% plan was 10% of the 1860 before the war voters had to, one, take a loyalty oath to the United States. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Boom, you took a loyalty oath. And the second thing was to accept emancipation. If you do this, you're in. And Louisiana and Arkansas jump on this and are readmitted even before the war officially ends. Now, this is very lenient. So to answer your question, all right, that was on the slide before. How is Lincoln going, all right, to go about Reconstruction? Very lenient, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness as God gives us the right to see firm. Let us bind up the nation's wounds. It's just like getting a cut. When you get a nice cut, right, you go ahead and you put a band-aid on it to heal it, to bring it back together. You just don't leave the cut gaping wide open, and therefore infection and possibly disease get into it, and then possibly get sick and die. You don't do that to a wound. You bind it up. Well, the nation had a pretty big wound in it. And so Lincoln is attempting to bring us back together in the most easy, simplistic way possible. All right. And that's his 10% plan. Now, this seemed quite light to many, and it was not liked by the radical Republican wing of the party. Radical Republicans, led by Thaddeus Stevens in the House of Representatives and Charles Sumner in the Senate, put together a proposal to replace Lincoln's 10% plan, and it was called the Wade-Davis Bill, and it called for an ironclad oath. People had to swear that they never supported the Confederate States of America, and you needed to have over 50% of a state's population to make that statement. Also, the Confederate States of America, each individual state had to pay off their debts to the United States before each individual state could re-enter. And then the third thing was all Confederate leaders, politically and militarily, were to be disenfranchised. Got another typo there. They can no longer vote, right? They can no longer vote. They are to be disenfranchised. So what these three things right here do is they really put the hammer down on the South. Instead of, if we go back and look, 10% right here, 10% of the 18 cities. So imagine there's 100 people, right? 10% of that would be 10. 10 people would only have to take a loyalty oath for the 100 people, and 10 people would have to accept emancipation. Boom, you're in. Whereas the radical Republicans come in and say 50% have to take a loyalty oath and also have to claim that they never supported the Confederate States of America. Then each individual state had to pay off their debts, and then all Confederate leaders, politically and militarily, were to be disenfranchised. They could no longer vote. To Lincoln, this seemed really harsh to the South, and it would take years for the Southern states to come back into the Union. And if there's one thing Lincoln wanted to do was to get all the states of the South back into the Union as quick as possible, and then we can deal with the issues. Remember his speech, with malice towards none, with charity for all. Let us bind up the nation wounds. So, with the Wade-Davis bill, Lincoln pocket vetoes it. It never becomes law. And, Congress is a little upset about that, but it's Abraham Lincoln. Like, they're not going to fight it too much. Lincoln is incredibly popular. All right. Now, some other things that the president did during presidential Reconstruction included the passage of the 13th Amendment, the abolishment of slavery. And another thing that President Lincoln created was this thing called the Freedmen's Bureau. It was an attempt to help African Americans transition from an enslaved person to a free person by way of providing education, healthcare, job placement, and the biggest thing it was going to do was redistribute abandoned land to African Americans. So they weren't going to go in and just take a plantation owner's land. If he still lived there, that was his land. But if the land was abandoned for any reason, that land then would be given to African Americans, and not only that, but poor whites as well too, to grant them land as well. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was this way of trying to create a system to help African Americans who were once enslaved, now are free. It's a way to help them, right, in education, healthcare, job placement, and then to redistribute abandoned land to African Americans. Right? The Freedmen's Bureau would mark the first time in American history that the federal government would dip into social welfare and labor relations for the American people. Prior to this time period, the American government had never dipped into social welfare and labor relations for the people. They considered that to be a state function, that the states should take care of that, not the federal government. Right? And this is the first time that the federal government's going to dip into social welfare and labor relations, which, thinking about it today, you couldn't imagine our federal government today not being involved in the social welfare and labor relations of the American people. Pardon, my dog is going absolutely crazy. But if you think about it, like, think of right now with the COVID-19 situation that's going on, and the bailout support that's coming to the American people, $1,200 per person, $2,400 for married couples. Again, that's social welfare and helping with labor relations. I mean, today you can't even think about the federal government not being involved in social welfare and labor relations. But again, the Freedmen's Bureau was the first time that our federal government had ever done something like that. And the Bureau would only last for 7 years, and it was and is considered a failure by many. Why? Well, you just have to hold on for that one. Right. However, with presidential Reconstruction, Lincoln never got to see his full Reconstruction plan through. As you know in history, he was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., by a Virginian, John Wilkes Booth. And now we enter into one of those points in history where the wrong man for the job takes over at the exact wrong time. With Lincoln's death, the new president would be, of course, the vice president, and that vice president is Andrew Johnson. Here's the kicker. Johnson was not a Republican like Lincoln. He was a Democrat from Tennessee who was part of the Tennessee Unionist Party. Still a Democrat, but he is part of the Union Democrat wing of the Democratic Party. Now, why did Lincoln, a Republican, put a Democrat on his ticket? One, he wanted to show solidarity with the South. He wanted to show Southerners that, hey, I'm putting a Southerner on my ticket as vice president. I'm showing I can work with Southerners. I can deal with Southerners. And of course, no one ever thought that Johnson would ever become president. But, well, as we know, Lincoln dies, and here comes in the wrong man at the wrong time, a Democrat from Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, who still technically believed in slavery, but did not believe in secession. And so therefore, he's going to be an opposition president. You have a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate of radical Republicans. And now you've got a Democrat, right, in the White House. And Johnson, understood this. And so he came out right away and said, I seek to continue Lincoln's Reconstruction policy of the 10% plan. Also, fun fact, and we'll get to it, he will be the first president in U.S. history to be impeached. All right. Like the slide before says, President Johnson sought to continue President Lincoln's Reconstruction policy. However, Congress had a different idea. President Johnson wasn't as strong as a figure as Lincoln was, and Congress felt that since he was a Union Democrat and would be easy on the South, they weren't about to let this happen. So now starts the second phase of Reconstruction, known as Radical Reconstruction. The Radicals were Republicans who were abolitionists. Not only did they want to end slavery, but many members of this wing of the Republican Party wanted to grant full citizenship rights to the 4 million newly freed people. Because of this stance, they were considered radical. They even disagreed with Lincoln in many areas. Lincoln was considered to be a moderate, not even a radical Republican. He's just a moderate Republican. And like I said in a couple slides before this, the radical Republicans were led by Thaddeus Stevens in the House of Representatives and Charles Sumner in the Senate. And at this time, the Republicans held control of the House and the Senate. And even if a moderate Republican disagreed with the radicals on certain points, they weren't going to go against them. They're not going to go against their party. It's like even today in politics. Let's say you're a Democrat and you're a moderate Democrat compared to the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. Moderate Democrats aren't going to go against liberal Democrats because that splits their vote. And then that means that the Republican or the opposite party can get their ideas pushed through. So the parties are going to bind together, whether it's a radical wing or a moderate wing. So the Republicans might have disagreed with some of the radicals, but they weren't going to go against them. Plus, the radicals had a pretty interesting tactic that they would use to make sure that the moderate Republicans and the people, for that matter, would not go against them. And it was this idea of waving the bloody shirt. Someone has to be responsible for all this bloodshed. Someone has to be responsible. Back up just a little bit. Lincoln was saying, with malice towards none. Malice means without hatred towards anyone, right? With charity for all. Lincoln saying no one has to be responsible for this war. We're all, as United States citizens, responsible for the war breaking out. But Lincoln's dead now. And so the radical Republicans disagreed with Lincoln on that stance and said, someone has to be responsible for all this bloodshed. And the South just happens to be a loser and the one that is responsible. In addition to Lincoln's plans, such as the 13th Amendment, Congress would then go ahead and push through what's known as the Reconstruction Acts. The Reconstruction Acts consist of three things. 1, military occupation of the South. 2, immediate suffrage for African American males. This will become the 15th Amendment. And don't confuse, don't, a lot of students at the time will say, what is the 15th Amendment? And they say African Americans garner the right to vote. Well, technically, they're half right. It's males only. Women, you still do not have the right to vote until the 19th Amendment, both black and white. So, number two is immediate suffrage for African American males, which will become the 15th Amendment, and then forced ratification of the 14th Amendment, which is equal protection under the law. All right. President Johnson, in an exercise of futility, attempts to veto each one of the Reconstruction Acts. However, Congress would then override his individual three vetoes and pass all three acts without the presidential signature that's needed. All right. Because President Johnson attempted to block the Reconstruction Acts, he made the Republicans in Congress really mad. Who's this Democrat think he is? Who's this Southerner think he is trying to block? He just needs to shut up, sit down, and just sign into law what we pass. He technically shouldn't be president anywho. In an attempt then to try to control President Johnson, Congress then passed what's known as the TOA, or the Tenure of Office Act, which stated that President Johnson could not remove any member of Lincoln's cabinet who are now serving under Johnson. Has nothing to do with Reconstruction, has nothing to do with the Civil War or anything. It's basically just kind of a screw you move, all right, to President Johnson, knowing that Johnson would not follow it. Johnson's sitting here going, I'm the president of the United States. Who does Congress think they are? They're passing this on me? And so, this has nothing to do with Reconstruction, but they know they know his personality and know he will not follow this, which Johnson doesn't. He fires Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Well, because of this, President Johnson just violated a congressional act. Therefore, impeachment charges were brought up, which then leads to the first impeachment of the United States president. The charges cleared the House of Representatives, and the impeachment trial was sent to the Senate for trial. However, President Johnson was not removed from office. The vote in the Senate fell one vote shy of removing him from office. And just a little tidbit, quick look at impeachment. 3 presidents have been impeached: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. 1 president has resigned. That's Richard Nixon. He was going to get impeached. There's no doubt about that because of Watergate. Awesome story. All right, but he resigned before that could ever take place. And 0 presidents have actually been removed from office. So, technically speaking, Bill Clinton was an impeached president. Andrew Johnson was an impeached president. Donald Trump is an impeached president, but they're still serving. Again, you can get impeached by the House, but then you have to go to trial in the Senate. And so with Johnson was impeached. All right, the trial went to the Senate, and it fell one vote shy of removing him from office. And while the radical Republicans did not get Johnson out of office, what they did do was make him mad. And if you remember from civics, there are things that the president can do that Congress cannot overturn. And now Johnson is going to go on a little revenge, right? A little bump in the Reconstruction of America. President Johnson knew that the Democrats were not going to nominate him for another term, and that the Republicans sure as heck weren't going to nominate him. And so Johnson became what's known as a lame duck president. He had just gone through the impeachment process and came away keeping his job. But knowing that he had nothing to lose and wanting to get back at the radical Republican in Congress, President Johnson issues General Amnesty of 1868. This was a blanket pardon to all Confederates that were jailed or were about to be jailed. So we're talking about Jeff Davis, the president of the Confederate States of America; Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederate States of America; any military leader that was jailed. If you did anything with the Confederacy, and prior to Johnson issuing this, you were going to be sentenced and you were going to go to jail, possibly to the gallows and be killed. That's done now, right? This blanket pardon goes ahead and sets free any Confederate that committed treason or committed any crimes against the United States. So basically, in one swoop of his pen, men who were jailed for committing high treason against the United States are now pardoned. They're released of all their crimes. And not only that, their records will show no knowledge of ever being in trouble, which means to some of them, they can rejoin Congress, right? And this is huge, right? Alexander Stephens, an example of this. Alexander Stephens Prior to the war breaking out, was a member of Congress from the state of Georgia. Well, when his state left, Stevens left with it. He became the vice president of the Confederate States of America. Well, because of Johnson's general amnesty of 1868, he was released from jail. His record was expunged. And guess what? Well, that's right. Johnson goes back to Congress in Washington, D.C., and regains his seat from Georgia. Again, like the war had never happened at all. And so this is the huge backfire right here that the Republicans did not really see coming. And this will have big, huge effects into the process of Reconstruction. But that's for the next lecture. In the upcoming presidential election, the Republicans nominate the war hero U.S. Grant. One, he wasn't going to stand in the way of the radical Republicans and would sign into law any piece of legislation that they passed. And two, everyone was going to vote for him. I mean, he's the hero of the nation. The problem was that the qualities that served Grant so great in war did not come to light as the President of the United States. His administration was rocked by scandal after scandal, which you'll learn about in American 2. And all that did was give fuel to the Democrats to attack the radical Republicans. Eventually, the nation would tire of the change that the Republicans were attempting to push. And this is when Reconstruction goes south. This is when everything that Lincoln and the radical Republicans had attempted to do, this is where it all falls apart on them. And that's going to be in the next lecture called Reconstruction Goes South and Reconstruction into the Future. I hope you guys enjoyed, and you're almost done, so keep pushing through, and I will talk to you later.